Well, good morning and welcome to our event, How Are States Managing the Broadband Billions? I'm Mark Jamison, a non-resident senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. On November 15th, 2021, President Joe Biden signed the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. It included $42.5 billion, that's billion with a B, for broadband development under what is now called the Broadband Equity and Access Deployment Program, or BEAD. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, oversees this program, but the heavy lifting is done by the states. This $42.5 billion is in addition to the other federal money sent to states for broadband, and in addition to money states are taking out of their own budgets. And there's more. In 2023, the Government Accountability Office reported that there are 133 federal programs administered by 15 agencies that could be used to expand broadband, and 25 of these have broadband as their main purpose. So when you take those 25 plus 50 plus state offices of broadband, we're close to 80 different government agencies having broadband development as their primary purpose. So it's so much money and so many programs and so many players. And some people who are new to this work, a lot could go wrong. There are political pressures, tight deadlines, a lot of misinformation. And what we wanted to know at AEI is, well, which states are leading and how are they ensuring that taxpayers are getting their money's worth? And what are the states learning? And as they learn, how do they conduct their course corrections? And how are they avoiding repeating all the many mistakes that we've made in the past? Here to discuss these issues are three leaders in the state efforts and a noted scholar. With us are Michelle Connolly, professor in the practice of economics at Duke University. Michelle served twice as chief economist for the Federal Communications Commission. Nate Denny, he's the deputy secretary for broadband and digital equity, North Carolina Department of Information Technology. Before joining DIT, he was a presidential appointee at the U.S. General Services Administration in Washington, D.C. And Vineeth Iyengar, he's the executive director of Connect LA in Louisiana. He is previously on the staff of the East Baton Rouge Parish Mayor President Sharon Weston Broome, and he co-chaired the governor's Resilient Louisiana Healthcare Task Force, and he was formerly with Sage Growth Partners. And we also have Jade Piros de Carvalho. She's director of the Kansas Office of Broadband Development. She previously worked for a Kansas broadband provider, served on the Hutchinson City Council, which included 3 terms as mayor. So Michelle, Nate, Vineeth, and Jade, welcome. I have a few questions for each of you, and around 11:10 a.m., we'll open the floor for questions from our audience. To our audience, if you have questions, please email those to Kate Beinkampen at aei.org. That's KATE.BEINKAMPEN at aei.org, or tweet, or I guess it's called Xing now, to hashtag AskAEITech. That's hashtag let me get it right. Hashtag AskAEITECH. So Vineeth, let's begin with you. Could you please lay the groundwork for our audience? I'll ask you later about some of the things you've been doing under Connect LA, but just explain in general terms what the BEAD program is like and kind of what the steps are in its processes.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Jamison, for convening the meeting. The relevancy of this conversation as states are knee-deep in the development of their initial proposals is really relevant and germane given the deadlines that we have. But as you said, Dr. Jamison, the BEAD program is signed. So it's really $42.5 billion. It's the Broadband Equity Access Deployment Program. It's the largest sum of money that's going to be administered by NTIA as part of the infrastructure bill. And so there's a sequence of activities that every state has to do in order to effectively draw down on the money. June 26th was an important date for all the states because we knew with finality what the states' different allocations are in terms of how much of that $42.5 billion states will receive. In our case, we're going to receive $1.355 billion from the BEAD program. And so in order to unlock formally the dollars so that you can start to execute those dollars to where it needs to go, most importantly, we have to provide several deliverables to NTIA. First is a 5-year action plan. The second is an initial proposal, which is really chunked up into 2 volumes. Volume 1, which is a lot more data centric in terms of the locations in a particular state that are potentially BEAD eligible, and then to outline a challenge process that we have to do as a precursor to awarding any grants. So that's volume 1. Volume 2 then is a sequence of answers to 15 different items within this larger initial proposal, where we have to address issues around resilience or affordability or subgrant program, how we're going to address labor, how we're going to build up our workforce, issues around middle class affordability, how we're going to work with minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, really focus on local and tribal coordination, and so on and so forth. So that's volume 2. And then we have to then execute a challenge process. And that's states have up to 90 days to execute a challenge process. We submit everything, 5-year action plan, volume 1, volume 2, and the challenge process results. Every state gets approval eventually. And then at that point, then states can then run a grant program. And so different states are in different phases. Fortunately for us, our volume 1 has been formally approved by the Assistant Secretary. We're now knee deep in looking at the comments that we received after the public comment period for volume 2. And so we will make changes to our initial proposal for volume 2, incorporate those comments, and then submit it to NTI shortly.
Well, let me ask just a little bit on kind of what that process is like. Since your initial plan's been approved, what's that engagement like with NTIA? Is it you've written down things and they say, if you don't clean this up, no money for you? Or do they work with you and say, well, you've gotten this close to right, but you need to change this to something else? How does that process work?
Right. So Dr. Jamison is very much, you're a faculty member. Michelle's a faculty member. You have a very collaborative working relationship and a very, sort of teacher-student approach, obviously, when you're grading papers and giving exams and so on and so forth. That's the equivocation that we feel in Louisiana we have with NTIA, right? It's very much, look, the average tenure of a broadband office is probably no more than 2 to 3 years. And so the fluidity of our office, the fluidity of the task is enormous given the size of the offices. And so we're fortunate in Louisiana that we have NTIA that has assigned a federal program officer for the state of Louisiana and for Georgia, who lives in New Orleans. And so we have extensive conversations with him in terms of, hey, when NTIA says this in the NOFO, what does it mean? We also include them in stakeholder engagement meetings that we go around the state, because it's also important for them to also understand locally what people are saying, what internet service providers are saying. And so there's that collaborative, very much teacher-student approach to a curing exercise that we work towards the development of a product and deliverable that will ensure that folks in Louisiana get access to internet.
Okay, so in some sense, NTIA has a person full-time in Louisiana, which you then work with. They're telling you they serve as kind of the Washington, D.C. expert, even though they're in Louisiana. And Correct. They're telling you, here's what you've got to do. Here are the boundaries. You have to stay within these boundaries. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they call it curing, right? It's a curing a conversation. It's, hey, this is what the federal guidance says. This is what the notice of funding opportunities for BEAD says. And so, when you reflect your answers, when you develop your answers, make sure it's reflective of what's being required as part of the NOFO. And part of it is a pitched conversation. When I say pitched conversation, there may be concepts or thoughts or themes that are unique to Louisiana that may have not been contemplated by NTIA, that we might go to NTIA and say, hey, what about this? And then they go through a process to evaluate whether it makes sense and whether it fits within the guardrails and guidelines of BEAD and the NOFO. And they'll say, hey, this makes sense, maybe tweak it here. I think you need to clarify a little bit more there. But again, I think the whole purpose and design of this process has been really collaborative from our perspective. It's been additive, and we're happy with the relationships that we have with NTI across the board.
All right, very good. Well, thank you so much for laying that groundwork. So Nate and Jade, let me turn to you. My sense from discussions I've had, plus what Vineet just said, is there are a lot of discussions going on between states with NTIA, a lot of engagements trying to figure out exactly how all this could be done and be done well. I was wondering, from your experiences, what keeps the state people up at night? What are some of their biggest worries? And please keep that in general themes. Most of our audience is not going to be up to their armpits in the details here. Just what is it that people say this is a difficult challenge? So Jade, let's begin with you, then we'll go to Nate.
Thank you, Dr. Jamison, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Looking forward to questions at the end as well. Well, there's no shortage of challenges in this program. That's what makes it so fun. So I'll just touch on a few that I think are kind of an issue across the board. One of those is permitting. Another is workforce. And if we have time, I'll touch on the possible lapse of the Affordable Connectivity Program. So workforce, Kansas is very lucky to enjoy a 2.7% unemployment rate, which is fantastic. But we know from data we've collected from internet service provider surveys, state agencies, the University of Kansas Research, and NTIA, that we may have across industry workforce shortage of about 6,000 people to do this deployment by 2026. And that doesn't even take into account some of the back office occupations, such as customer service roles, administrative roles, et cetera. And so it's definitely an opportunity for us to build up a new generation of people in this industry, to upskill people in older generations to go into this industry. But at the end of the day, we just need more bodies, right? And so I think that's something that really concerns me. Thankfully, NTIA has, anticipated this issue and is requiring a workforce development plan in, I think it's requirement 12 of the initial proposal volume 2. So every state will be tasked with outlining some goals to achieve and some of the strategies that they're going to undertake to fix these workforce shortfalls. Secondly, on the permitting side, we are doing what we can at the state and local levels to really streamline permitting processes, to educate agencies and municipalities and counties on the importance of permitting and for quick deployment, and also to incent communities to adopt something called broadband readiness. But when it comes to the federal government, there are 13 federal agencies involved in the permitting process of infrastructure projects on federal land, and those timelines lie largely outside of our control, right? I was on a panel and in one broadband event where someone said without flinching, oh, it could be an 18-month approval process for a permit of that type. And I thought, ooh, the math just doesn't work there if we're trying to get this done in 4 or 5 years. And so we know that this is on Congress's mind. I think Senator Sinema and Barrasso just this week introduced a bill to help streamline federal permitting processes. I know, I think earlier in the spring there was a hearing on this. So I'm confident that Congress has this top of mind and hopefully will make movement on that, should they be able to keep the government open. And then lastly, the Affordable Connectivity Program, if you're not familiar with that, is a subsidy to low-income households of $30 for broadband service. We do have about 21 million Americans on that program right now, including 121,000 Kansans. I'm a little concerned if that program is allowed to lapse, which it is scheduled to do early next year, probably spring next year, that providers are going to take that into account when they are looking at possible network deployments in lower income areas because the OpEx is already so tight on some of these sparsely populated lower income areas. So it's going to definitely, I think, factor into their business decisions. So I would like to see the refunding of that program as well. Those are just a few items. I'm sure Nate has some more to share.
All right. And he'll probably share some workforce people with you as well, since
Right.
you struggle a little bit in Kansas. So, okay, just to make sure I understand. So the three primary concerns, at least on your mind, are getting the resources, primarily labor, getting the permission to get things done, that's the permitting, and then affordability. Will at least the low income people be able to afford broadband once it is made available?
Yes, but Dr. Jamison, I also wanted to add a little bit of nuance to affordability. Yes, it's affordability for millions of Americans, but it also factors into the long-term sustainability of the networks. So we don't want to build a network that isn't going to have the revenue to then be able to survive without a constant inflow of taxpayer dollars. And so I know ACP is a taxpayer funded vehicle, but I'm talking about additional billions and billions constantly going to providers just to maintain the network. I think this is a good kind of middle ground to make sure that people who can't afford it can still subscribe and get the benefits.
Okay, and you raise an issue that isn't actually provided for in the legislation. Some of the scholars that have trotted around the world a little bit, we know that other countries have addressed it, and that is that if an area needs subsidies for broadband to be commercially viable, it may not be a one-off. This legislation treats it as a one-off, and hopefully that's all it is, but sometimes that's not quite the case, and that may be a struggle down the road. So I'm glad you raised that. Thank you. So Nate, let me turn to you. You're part of these conversations too. What keeps others up at night?
Well, thanks, Dr. Jamison, for the question, and to AEI for the chance to come talk about our work in North Carolina. Lest you think Jade is an outlier, my notes are permitting, workforce, ACP for things that keep me up at night. So I'll try to tweak those. I think that Jade covered permitting issues really thoroughly. I think that rail is a concern. I think local permitting. We don't have as prominent a federal land presence as some Western states do. So that's a little bit less of an issue, but still one that's on our mind and something that we're thinking about as we build partnerships with our State Department of Transportation, with local municipalities, and with rail providers that have a presence in North Carolina. Labor supply, obviously, you can subsidize all the fiber you want, but somebody's got to dig a trench, right? Somebody's got to climb a pole, somebody's got to hang the line, and that's a major concern for us. So we're certainly talking about credentialing, right? Figuring out how we can make investments through our community college system, partnering with internet providers, fiber optic manufacturers, which we're very fortunate to have a major presence between Corning and CommScope and others in Western North Carolina. I think I want to talk more about ACP because that's really, I think, the most urgent problem facing all of our mission here, right? All of our work here. But I also want to address local capacity because I think it ties to permitting, right? Everybody's stretched with this work. I know my team is, I know Jade and Vinith's teams are. I know that the providers are, right, trying to track various programs. We are wearing our providers out with compliance issues, with mapping questions right now. Every time we ask them to go in and tweak an application, we're ruining somebody's weekend. But local capacity is a major challenge here because at least in North Carolina, we're really working to amplify local community leadership in developing scopes of work and our strategic planning around these investments. I think one of the things that Congress and the Biden administration did well is to say, we're going to turn to the states for these investments instead of running it out of DC, right? We're going to put the money closer to the need, right? And we're trying to replicate that in North Carolina and try to make sure that county governments in particular are at the table negotiating directly with internet providers because they know the need best. And they're strapped too. You know, we've got poor, economically distressed counties in North Carolina that have like a part-time IT guy who's been tasked with broadband planning, right? And that's not going to work. So one of our central questions is, how do we both create opportunities for local voices, but also supplement that planning capacity, the mapping expertise, the analysis needed at the local level to figure out where these investments make sense. I think it's really important because, you know, we're all trying to move quickly. Everybody needs their broadband yesterday, right? But we also need to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And this is a tremendous investment. We're never going to see an investment of this scale again in high-speed internet infrastructure deployment. And so we got to make sure that we are deploying it accountably with local perspectives in mind about how that matters. I know Jade, as a mayor, you know, can certainly appreciate the urgency of that local voice in, you know, when you're sitting down with a large national internet provider. So that's one thought. On ACP, you know, we can't talk about it enough. I could run fiber right up to your front door. And if you can't afford the service that results from it, or you don't have a laptop or tablet at home, or the basic skills to search for a job online or access government services, or really any other part of modern life, right, you're still going to be left behind. And I think we all have a major faith and trust issue if we aren't addressing that need, right? If we're spending billions of dollars on running this infrastructure, largely, I should add, it subsidizing private sector internet providers, right, their deployment of service, and folks can't benefit from that service at the end of the day, then I think we're all in trouble. In North Carolina, we've got more than 851,000 enrollees in the Affordable Connectivity Program. That is around 48% of the eligible population. I think we're fourth or fifth nationally in terms of percentage of eligible population enrolled. We've really been leaning hard on pushing people through that program, investing in digital navigator services so that folks know how to navigate the federal bureaucracy and access those resources. But we know that the average internet cost, subscription cost, is over $60 a month. Right? We know that on average, that's more than 2% of monthly income for North Carolina households. That's too much, right, for them to benefit from these major taxpayer investments. So this is an area, and I know Congress has other things that they're struggling to do right now, right? But this is an area that needs immediate attention. Governor Cooper just this week wrote a letter to our entire North Carolina congressional delegation urging support. I know that John Bell Edwards in Louisiana has similarly advocated for Congress to do something here, because these are districts, both urban and rural, liberal and conservative, that have tremendous need, right, for the ability to access the modern economy. And we can't do it, and we will all fail, I think, if Congress doesn't do something about the affordability issue. That's what's keeping me up at night.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for that. And for our audience, this doesn't alter the conversation here at all, but for our audience, we do have a program on Monday targeting that affordability issue and how that flows out in this particular program. So anyway, Michelle, let me turn to you now. So you see this effort, these issues through the eyes of a scholar, but a scholar that's been on the front lines of broadband development for several years now. So what are the kinds of things that keep you up at night with respect to what's going on? Oh, you're muted, Michelle.
You like me better that way. For me, so my background originally was in macroeconomics, and so I'm going to make that statement to explain that what I worry about is the general equilibrium that's being set up. And by that, I mean the fact that there's a lot of money being spent, and its intent was to get broadband deployment and adoption. Let's focus first on deployment to places where it wouldn't otherwise go. Right. And so by definition, I would call that the unserved areas. And that, I think, has been the motivation behind all of these efforts. My concern is that because of how underserved areas have been defined, and the fact that they actually have service and they're more economically attractive than unserved areas, and that they're probably closer to the existing footprints of ISPs, et cetera, et cetera. My concern is that we're setting things up in a way that's going to divert the money and the attention away from truly unserved areas in favor of what are being defined as underserved. And the definition that has been set for that is a very high bar. So you can have, significant number of competitors and still not hit that bar. You can have reliable service and still be hitting that bar. So any attention that's diverted away from the unserved towards the underserved makes it more likely that the unserved will end up not being taken care of. And even like the point that Jade made, maybe, in the areas that are very sparsely populated, that are expensive not only to deploy, but in terms of the expected profitability for a provider, if there's a large population, longer term, she's correctly made the point that that's a concern. Well, rather than saying we're going to spend all this money everywhere except for where we really need it, and then because we spent it everywhere except for where we really need it, now we need more money to sustain the areas that really need it. So I think this is a case where everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too, and the people who aren't going to get any cake are the people who really need it.
I have a follow-up question for you, Michelle. So both Jade and Nate talked about workforce issues. Macroeconomists, I'll just take advantage of that. If we have low unemployment rates, that means that people hired into doing this kind of work are coming from someplace else in all probability. There may be some people sitting on the sidelines that could really step in and do it, but chances are they're going to come from someplace else. So what are your thoughts? What are we going to see less of? Because we're putting resources into the broadband area, and how might that affect the different states?
So sorry, I thought you were going somewhere else with that question.
Oh, well, you take a more reasonable place if you wish. That's fine.
Well, okay, so sorry, are you trying to say in terms of what is this going to pull labor away from?
Yeah, well, because the Infrastructure Act was putting money into utility infrastructure, roads, et cetera, with Kansas having less than 3% unemployment. If you're putting money into those, that means people are going to be doing less of something else. I was just wondering how you saw that shift.
Yes. Okay. Well, so I think I know where you're going. I mean, so fundamentally, when you're constrained and you're shifting resources. So in the same fashion, I was saying, well, if we shift resources in favor of underserved rather than unserved, just by the fact that they're being there, you're also shifting investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the investment is occurring, who's doing it, and how they're doing it. And to the extent, if you're making it possible for firms to be subsidized in areas where they might go naturally themselves, then you are somewhat substituting for this private investment. And certainly ISPs are not going to complain about that. But if we have limited funds and limited workforce and limited everything, we want to make sure that those go to the right areas, and even thinking about just taxpayer dollars. we shouldn't just say, yeah, let's throw $100 billion out the window. And if we can tell that a year from now, we're going to need to ask for money again, let's do it. It's like, well, no, how about we actually set this up in a sustainable fashion? Because $100 billion should be enough to do this. When you actually look at the population that's in truly unserved areas, that should be more than enough to do it.
Mhm.
But I don't think it's going to happen. And part of the reason that I've mentioned is really kind of a diversion of funds. But beyond that, there are a lot of things in the requirements and the guidelines of the NTIA that are pushing up the costs of every new household that will be passed, or every household that will be passed a second or third or fourth time, because there, at least the initial rules were saying things like we have to buy American, we have to use unionized labor, or a specialized labor agreement. We have to do fiber above all, even though fiber is going to be the one that's most timely, like takes the longest time to get out to more rural areas in terms of deployment. It's going to be the most expensive. It's also going to therefore favor people submitting plans that are closer to their existing footprints, and therefore, again, not the truly unserved areas, and will eat up money very quickly. So I've heard people from NTI say, we'll just do fiber everywhere we can first, and then when it's no longer possible, we'll look at other technologies. Well, that's exactly saying that they're going to focus on the unserved last, not first. So that seems completely backwards. And this notion that if in the bidding process, whatever state does, there are a lot of impositions, such as, no network management, no data caps. So one thing is having a low cost plan, but another thing is saying we may regulate your prices for middle class. Well, that's price regulation that we've never seen in this industry. That isn't clear to me why we need it. And let me even mention, we're talking about ACP, and ACP is currently offering $30 if you're a regular subscriber. If you're on tribal land, $75. I haven't heard many people say is that most major ISPs were offering $20 a month plans before ACP. You didn't need $30 to get for low income. If you qualify it for low income, most of these companies had plans that were $20. Those plans have now gone up to $30 because that's what the ACP is offering. So I entirely agree. If a family cannot afford this and wants it and needs it, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be support for that. However, that's not the same thing as saying we need to regulate all the prices, because I'm guessing the middle class of America is most of America. If we regulate prices for them, we're regulating this all the way. And we're making a lot of assumptions about adoption, which empirically there have been studies that have shown cost is not usually the largest factor in terms of adoption. And I've done some work on this myself, that it's kind of an interest in the internet. So, an 80-year-old, you can make it free, they still aren't going to go on, right? That kind of thing. So we have a lot of money, we have a huge opportunity, and I just don't want it squandered.
All right. Well,
and I'm not saying the states are doing that. I'm saying the NTI is setting it up for that.
All right. Very good. So, okay. Thank you, Michelle. So, Vineet, I now want to turn to you. So you've heard Michelle's concerns. And I was wondering how with Connect LA, and I've looked a little bit at what you do. You have a gumbo program that you've already been operating for a while. I couldn't quite tell some of the things of how it worked. but you have some experience addressing at least some of Michelle's concerns. I was wondering if you could talk about those. So she talked about things like, are we going to get all the coverage that we should get? She talked about, are we using rules that make the cost too high? And one of those that she did not bring up is, what's the competitive process that is used? As I looked at programs in all three of your states, they appear to be programs where people say, I would like to do this, and they propose that, and then they decide whether to get funding. There are other methods that can save quite a bit of money. And so I'm wondering a little bit about your thoughts on what you're doing to assuage some of these concerns, make sure we get the coverage, make sure that the taxpayers are getting the very best bang for their buck. And one other thing is, we've looked in the past, something that we've pretty much always failed on in these kinds of programs is holding the providers accountable. Once they get the money, once the programs kind of run its cycle, some of them just close up shop. And what are your thoughts? How are you addressing that for the people of Louisiana?
So that's a lot of questions.
Yes,
So
it is. But you're capable of doing it.
I'll try to break it down. The most important thing that we have to remember is everything that we do, especially at the state level, is undergirded by data that the providers submit to the FCC every 6 months. So I'm not going to litigate what's happened in the past, because my brain can only take in so much information. And so, we in Louisiana have visited personally nearly 100 cities, towns, and villages. And the common complaint that we hear is the fact that an ISP says that they're providing data, and they tell us that the service is not being provided. So where we direct our dollars are really contingent upon the accuracy of provider fed information to a map that's address level. Because if we don't get that right, then we're misdirecting dollars. And that's why this challenge process is going to be critical. Over the last 2 weeks, we have spent an inordinate amount of time really coaching up nonprofits and parish officials, people, as Nate said, really know far better than far better than us, who is truly providing what and the quality of the service that's being provided to those households. The second is this, we're not every state's going to get a bolus of capital that they feel is going to solve the problem, because the execution of these dollars is going to be based on the strength and quality of broadband officials and the strength and quality of folks at a state level from an execution risk perspective. And so when we started our efforts 2.5 years ago, and we're very big believers in our office of process improvement and behavior improvement based on what we've learned through grant programs. First thing that we did with our $176 million that we received from Treasury was to create a grant program where the ISPs defined project areas. And while we understood that they were going to likely focus on those areas that were going to generate the most return, we understood that they were building off other federal programs that existed in Louisiana. And so when I say other federal programs that exist in Louisiana, we have 175,692 locations that have an enforceable commitment through RDOF. We have close to 20,000 locations that have an enforceable commitment from the NTIA's Broadband Infrastructure Program, which is another grant program. We have a number of enforceable commitments through the CPF dollars. And that's, and so what you see in Louisiana is you have various different federal programs. And what you have is each of those federal programs are stacking on top of each other in terms of coverage and service availability. We think in Louisiana, we have probably anywhere between 200 and 245,000 households and small businesses that are BEAD eligible. We think the cost, now, NTIA is asking every state what you think the costs are to build. We think the cost for that 200 to 245,000 could be anywhere between 645 million to 800 to 900, could be $1 billion. If we make the policy decision that A certain percentage of the build has to be built underground to ensure resilience. What you're effectively doing is you're creating a longer term, more affordable product for a consumer if you build very high quality resilient infrastructure, because then if something happens to that infrastructure, they're not passing off those costs onto the consumer, right? And so from our perspective, how we're going to design the grant program based off the challenge process results is going to be critical. The next 6 to 9 months is going to be critical. We do the challenge process, we truly adjudicate and see who's serving what, at what speeds, and so on and so forth. We have a clean map. And what we're doing behaviorally, Dr. Jamison, in our case, from a grant program is, if you look at our volume 2 draft of our sub-grant program, based on those that we feel are BEAD eligible, we're going to likely create 2,000 project areas in the state of Louisiana, each having between 80 and 100 locations that are unserved and underserved, with more unserved. And the way that there's a geographic clustering in Louisiana based on our analysis is that in a project area, you're going to have significantly more unserved than underserved, right? And the way it works is when you apply for the funds and when you bid, you have to assume responsibility for the entire census block, meaning all the locations in that location, right? So Michelle, it's really from the FCC days, it looks like a reverse auction behaviorally, though it's a little bit modified. And what we're trying to do is to ensure that those donut holes don't exist. Because to your point, there are going to be specific locations in Louisiana where the cost of building fiber is going to be prohibitively expensive. Now, could we make the policy decision to invest $50,000, $100,000 to get to that household? Sure. Can we do it with the funds that we have given the other federal programs? Yes. Will we necessarily do it? Probably not, right? And so for those folks, we're going to have to find another solution to help address those, which could be fixed wireless or satellite.
All right, I appreciate that. So to make sure I understand, the way you are moving forward and the way you're choosing who receives money going forward is to define an area and say, I want service in this area. It has to meet these kinds of standards. And you make people compete for serving that area. And they're competing, at least in part, based upon how much of a subsidy of a grant they would need. Am I understanding correctly?
Correct.
Okay, very good. Yeah, as I've looked around at the states, I would characterize most of the competitions that I've seen in the past anyway as competitions for money as opposed to competition for business. And it's the competition for business that all of our experiences, all of our research says works much better. And it sounds like you're moving towards that. Okay, I appreciate your
That's right.
That. So Jade, let me now turn to you. I've looked at the LINK program that you have, and I have to say it was pretty easy to understand from your website. That was really good. Thank you so much. It's hard to explain these things on a website. I think you did a fine job with that. But tell us, you've had some experiences already with competition for grants. Now you're going to take a big step into it with BEAD. From the concerns you've heard Michelle say, or I've said, or anybody else, how are you moving forward? What kinds of lessons are you learning? How are you adjusting?
Yeah, thank you. And I think Dr. Connolly brought up some really important points. There have been enormous past failures in programs, despite everyone's best intentions. And so how do we best learn from that? We are a relatively new office. We were established in late 2020, but we have completed 135 projects over 5 different programs and got iteratively better and improved those. So I wanted to touch on just a few things that we're doing to prevent what I see as the largest genesis of failures in past programs. I see past programs really failed in 2 major ways. And one was the proper vetting of applicants on the front side for these funds and proper post-award compliance, holding their feet to the fire for actually delivering on their contractual obligations. So, I'll use capital projects fund since we already administered that. LINK is somewhat similar because it is also a Treasury program. Last July, we were awarded $83.5 million in funds for broadband deployment through the ARPA Capital Projects Fund. we were able to get that money out the door in just a few months and get that to work for Kansans. On the pre-award side, we evaluate financial, technical, and managerial capacity so that we're only awarding to providers we know can actually deliver what they promise. In the past, we have required applicants to be an established service provider for at least 3 years in the state of Kansas. We won't be able to do that with BEAD, but we will be able to ensure that outside entrants into our market have certification that they have sufficient operational capabilities. This is all going to be outlined, again, in our initial proposal, volume 2. This will be in section 8, sub-grantee selection process. So on the financial side, we require verification that the applicant has sufficient funds available to provide the minimum match. We do not require a letter of credit. We think that restrains our competition in applications, but we do require some level of certification from a financial partner. We take into consider past performance. We have always required a challenge process. One thing Dr. Connolly brought up is that, we don't want to invest in areas that are already probably going to receive private investment. So this challenge process lets providers weigh in not only on if they see overlap in a proposed project area with network they already have, but they can also share with us if they have a project underway or a planned project. And as long as they attest to that or show some evidence, we will take those locations off the table for public funding. Post-award, I think one thing really great about having this process done through the states is that we're closer and can do those technical field audits more easily, can follow up more regularly with the providers. We have always required monthly reporting and quarterly reimbursement or quarterly payments on a reimbursement basis. So we don't give the money out on the front side and hope everything works out okay. We require milestones for reimbursement. We hold 10% back on closeout until we can validate and certify that the network was built. We do have clawback provisions in our contract, but because everything is done by reimbursement, they're not as necessary, but they're just in there as a safeguard. We also do ban companies who don't follow through on their obligations from participation in our programs for at least 2 years. We've never had to do that, but we have had to threaten it once. So we really feel like our programs are built to withstand a level of scrutiny that they should be withstanding because these are public funds. One thing I did want to touch on that Dr. Connolly brought up, that past programs have also allowed providers to identify areas that they want to invest in, which she expertly pointed out that has led to really, they may be underserved, but you're not really getting at the very, very needy. And so what NTIA has done is mandate that states serve all of the unserved premises before they have to have a plan to serve the unserved, those locations that lack 25/3 service, before moving on to the underserved, those that lack 100/20, before moving on to the community anchor institutions such as healthcare facilities that lack 1 gig service. Now, obviously, the way networks are built, you're going to pick up on underserved along the way as you're building this unserved. But I do think that is a significant fundamental difference. Also the biggest difference is that we're not trying to put money out there and say, how many people can we serve? Like, let's get the most amount of people we can serve. This program is built to serve everyone, right? And so it's a different mandate. It's internet for all, not internet for all that this particular tranche of funding can get to. And so I do think that we're going to get a lot closer and we're going to hit those areas that have been harder to reach in the past. And the last thing I'll bring up is that I completely respect the comments about the benefits of alternative technologies as far as timelines and cost. But I will say that I think that our country has embraced a buy cheap, buy twice strategy for broadband investment that has created a system of constant subsidization to these areas because we're bringing the bare minimum. And then a couple years later, we need another flow of money. So even though it's frustrating that fiber, for instance, takes longer, I do think if we build it once and build it right, it'll be a longer lasting investment. And then we follow it up with proper compliance and accountability measures. And as long as we're able to learn from those past failures, I think we'll be a lot more successful.
All right, Michelle?
Ask a question. So I know in the NOFOs, they said, you have to have a plan for unserved before you do this and you do this. But what happens if, like, in the competitive bidding process, no one says they're interested in a particular set of unserved areas? Does that count as having a plan, or does that not? Like, so I've read that language, but it's not entirely clear to me what that means in action, or it's going to depend on each state.
Well, it is going to be dependent on each state. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon states to identify areas that have a good grouping of really remote and other locations that make it more attractive for bidding. In Kansas, we are contemplating doing project areas by school district, because those naturally have population centers and then people on the outskirts. And then again, like Vineeth said, providers would be required to apply for the entire project area. It's an all or nothing situation. And having those areas defined by the state instead of maybe by the providers allows us to do that more apples to apples cost and technical comparison. But no, that's a great question. I'm really curious how other states are going to do it. It's going to be a little different in every state, and hopefully we don't have areas that aren't bid on.
I'll just add in, when this problem that Michelle brings up has been encountered in other countries, that you defined areas and no one bid, the process has been to do another round of bidding, offer a larger subsidy, and that has always worked, because it's always difficult to know how much money is needed. That's why we have competition, is to get people to tell us the truth about how much it would actually cost them to do things. And interesting enough, in the early days of these types of competitions, you'd find out there were some areas that the provider said, actually, I don't need a subsidy, I'll just build it anyway. And there's long stories behind why they would do that, but it does indeed happen. It may not happen here because of the types of companies we have and the extent of our coverage already. But it's interesting what you learn as these processes unfold. So Nate, let me turn to you now. You've listened to the discussion, some of the concerns. How are you in North Carolina improving steps as you go forward? You've heard the concerns, you've learned lessons, because you've been operating since 2019 or something like that. So you've got more experience than the rest of us here. So what are you doing?
Well, I appreciate all the discussion here, and we've had a state broadband office operating since about 2015. I've only been working directly with that office since 2021, but I've got a few thoughts. One, to your point, competition will tell us where higher rates of subsidization are needed, and tell us where a more diverse range of technology solutions are needed too, right? I think we've always said in North Carolina, we want fiber everywhere we can get it, but we know that there will be parts of the state that are too slow or too expensive for a fiber solution. So I think we are anticipating that fixed wireless, low Earth orbit satellite, and other technologies will be critical if we really want every North Carolinian to have a high-speed connection. To Professor Connolly's point earlier, one of the reasons we're going to be successful in North Carolina is because the governor allocated more than $1 billion in American Rescue Plan funds to closing the digital divide before waiting on BEAD, right? So we've got a very traditional rural deployment subsidy program or incentive program, I think similar to what's been described here already in other states, called the GREAT Grant, or Growing Rural Economies with Access to Technology. They love their acronyms over in the General Assembly. But that program, using ARPA funds, is limited to unserved locations. And we've now awarded $350 million to serve with fiber, with 100 symmetrical service, 144,000 households and businesses across the state in 92 of our 100 counties. I think that all of those projects come with a commitment to participate in the ACP long term. All of them are limited exclusively to unserved locations. And we've got a lot of the similar kind of clawback and other compliance tools or enforcement tools that Vineet and Jade have mentioned in their states. But that program still leans on providers, to get to Professor Connolly's concern, still leans on providers coming to us with a project scope, right? We've got, our General Assembly is very, very prescriptive, right? So we've got about a dozen statutorily prescribed criteria that we use to judge a project that's been proposed to us. We spit out a certain score. That score determines a certain level match from the provider. I should mention, of our $350 million of awards, that's about 126 projects statewide. Those 126 projects have gained an additional $180 million of investment from the provider that's got skin in the game, right? And I think that's a critical piece here. But if we want to succeed, we need that local voice, right? And so we're shifting to more of a procurement model with our next program, the Completing Access to Broadband program, where we're using the state IT department's procurement authority to pre-qualify providers statewide to address county-driven scopes of work. So we've got 40-ish providers going through that procurement process right now. We'll probably award next month, and then be able to go to every county manager in the state and say, here's your menu. Here's your short list of 2, 6, 8 providers that are willing to serve, capable of serving, have the financial wherewithal to actually deliver, and then allow the county to make a best value procurement decision that takes into account long-term affordability for its residents, that takes into account resilience of technology like fiber, right? Underground versus aerial deployment, critical community anchor institutions where needed, potentially underserved pockets of residents after all the unserved locations have been dealt with. And we think, the real benefit of that program is that at the end of a procurement, you get to a best and final offer negotiation where the state, the county officials, and the internet provider are sitting at a table saying, how do we make this work? You really want us to heavily subsidize this build out. We really need you to address this pocket of really hard to connect locations. And I think that program and the responses we get from industry are going to help us quickly identify those hardest to serve areas where we need to lean on a higher rate of subsidization, or we need to look to other technologies, other provider types. And so our whole goal there is to shift the burden, right, back to the provider to justify the subsidy instead of just waiting to see what they come to us with.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that, Nate, because you have quite a few criteria. I think Kansas has like 16, Louisiana has 23. That gets pretty difficult to weigh. It can get a little subjective, and transparency gets really difficult as well. One of my favorite stories, I won't go into it in any depth, on competition for offering telecommunications, was a country that I won't name. Effectively, their bids were an Excel spreadsheet, and they said, fill out these cells. They opened those spreadsheets in public. The macros generated the numbers, and there was the winner, which was really risky because this was not a country known for transparency. So they had their jobs on the line. But it all worked, and it worked incredibly well. It became a very famous case for a while. So tell us a little bit about how you're able to make the public, the taxpayers, confident that this is all working well. We're in negotiations. We've got a lot of criteria, but this is being handled well. Your tax dollars are being treated fairly.
Well, I think that's a huge challenge. And I think that Jade and Vineeth would agree. There's a level of frustration across our state with people who've been waiting a long time to get the access to technology that they need to keep up in the modern economy, right? I was in a town hall a week ago with one of our state representatives who convened a small gathering at a public library of folks who are ticked off, right? They've been waiting for the providers to respond. They've seen prior federal subsidy programs. They've been getting promises for a long time. There's no magic fix, especially when what you're delivering is an award that is really a 2-year construction project, right? I can't say you'll be able to turn on a router in your house next week, right? I'll say, yeah, we'll get to you in a year and a half if the provider's ahead of project delivery schedule, right? That's a tough sell, right? But I think that the answer, as Vineeth talked about, is high level of visibility, constant communication. I think one of the things NTIA has done particularly well is really put the pressure on us as state broadband leaders to make sure that we're going the extra mile in terms of stakeholder engagement, that we are engaging our local government organizations, in our case, League of Municipalities and County Commissioners Association were critical partners as we built our 5-year plan for BEAD. I think we've done now about 150 different stakeholder conversations, particularly around digital equity needs and covered populations. So that there's just a huge focus from the federal government on, incentivizing our accessibility, right, and our transparency as we put these plans together. No one in Granville County, North Carolina, where I was last week, wants to hear I'm here from the government to help, right? Like that doesn't sell anybody on fixing their problems. But I think that having a voice in our planning process does, right? Having the ability to weigh in on what these projects, right? And shifting the planning strategic direction from not to mention DC, but even from Raleigh to downtown Lewisburg in Eastern North Carolina, I think makes all the difference in the world.
All right. Well, thank you very much for explaining that. Michelle, let me turn back to you. So you've heard our representatives from the state broadband offices talking about how they've learned different things, how they think they're going to be trying to improve things in the future. What's your feedback and kind of what's your advice to the states?
I mean, I'm kind of impressed in the sense that what I'm hearing from these 3 states is that as they're going through this process, they're kind of recognizing the constraints, and several of the things that they're telling me they're doing are exactly what we would do when we create a reverse auction. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very happy and impressed that, non-economists also figured out this makes sense to approach it in a certain way. And so that I think is key. The one thing that I would push back slightly on is, I've heard about, doing things cheaply and then having to do them twice, or things being resilient or not. And a reality is that fiber is not forever either. In fact, fiber, I think, has to be replaced after about 5 years. If I remember correctly from a conference when someone was talking who actually puts the middle mile in, or that there's some decay. So I think in a lot of the policy debates, it's been like, oh, well, you do fiber, it's one and done, and you'll never have to do anything again. That's not technically true. And it's not necessarily the case that other technologies aren't reliable. I think other technologies can have true capacity constraints. And so, for example, I remember being in Florida, speaking to some commissioners who, for their local area, they felt bad because they had used fixed wireless to provide broadband service locally, and it worked really well initially. But then, as more and more people joined, the service started getting worse. It wasn't that the service was failing, it's just that they were hitting a capacity constraint. And so clearly at that point, you need to add more capacity. But if we're thinking about the present value of the cost of investing in something against what you're gaining from it, it is not necessarily the case that you want to spend the absolute most upfront and the most expensive item. In present value terms, that's not necessarily cheaper than kind of building out what you need now, increasing capacity later. And when we think about the time, so Nate, you're saying, it's going to be 2 years at best if I get there. But what if there's a technology that you could get it there in 6 months? That household might prefer the trade-off of getting it a year and a half earlier, even if it's not 100 symmetric. And nothing wireless can be symmetric by definition. So that's just something I want to kind of point out, that it's easy for us to get wrapped up in like there is a best solution. It's a one size fits all. And I think the technological realities are more nuanced. And the fact that low Earth orbit satellite only started really providing service in 2021 and is already providing service in so many places is just proof that we never really know what the new technology will be capable of and what we'll still think is the gold standard in 5 years.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So in a few minutes, we'll go to the audience for questions. If you have questions, you're a member of our audience, please let me remind you how you can get back with us on this. You can email your questions to Kate. That's KATE.BEINKAMPEN@AEI.org, or you can tweet or X to us at hashtag AskAEITech, and that's hashtag AskAEITECH. One last question before we turn to the audience, though. Vineet, tell us what the path forward is for states, and how. What steps they still need to take, and if someone in our audience wants to get engaged with their state broadband office, what should they do?
Say the last bit one more time, Mark.
Oh, if someone wants to get engaged with their state broadband office, what should they do?
Well, we have a pretty much an open door policy. We talk to anyone and everyone because to Michelle's point, in Louisiana, for instance, we have 64 different parishes. Parishes is a county, and every parish will have their own unique particular challenge when it comes to digital skills, affordability, access in devices. And so it's really important to understand the unique challenges that people from different parishes, but also what the use case is for people that have different different needs on the use of broadband to impacting their lives, both professionally and personally. Because the use case for someone who's a farmer, for instance, is going to be far different than the use case of broadband for someone in the healthcare industry. And so I think it's really important to understand what those use cases are, because once you start to show value through those use cases, then it helps to address issues around adoption. Because, to your point, when it comes to broadband, or the litmus test for us is to ensure access. Now, it's not our job to ensure that that person pays for it, right? I mean, that's up to them. That's the consumer's choice. So, and so from our perspective, we need to show as much value as possible for the consumer to understand how internet can benefit his or her life. And sometimes we miss some of those things and we hear what those are on the ground.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm told we don't have any questions from the audience yet, so I still have lots of questions.
Can I just do an errata? Because I said
Sure.
5 and then 5 didn't sound right. So I just looked up, it's 25 years. The 5 remained in my mind. I got the year, but it's just to make the point that not everything's permanent.
All right, very good. So I have a question, and I'm not sure who to ask it to. So Jade, I'll turn to you. I know you're having some technology issues, but we'll hopefully get that figured out. So I've had a lot of experiences in these types of processes, one of which was with something like this. And I want to know from you, is this okay? And if it's not, what would you do to try and prevent it? So here was the situation. This isn't a story about any of these states, but there was a state broadband office that was allowing some grants for building broadband, had a competitive process for it, had decided here are the companies that will get money, the organizations that will get money for building broadband. And the governor's office calls up and says, hey, I understand you're kind of made your decision, so send us the list of people. And so the broadband office did. And the governor's office calls back and says, I don't see, and I won't name the company, say it's Joe's Fiber Optics. You don't see Joe's Fiber Optics on there. Joe's a fine fellow. He does really, really, really good work. He should be one of the providers. Now, is that okay? Do you want the governor or someone else, maybe the president of the Senate or something in your state, you want them involved in that? And if not, how do you prevent that kind of a thing? So Jade, I'll start with you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, just well.
I do apologize. This is the third device. I look like a Luddite. I really do know how to use Zoom. I will mention that NTIA has set up this process to be as divorced as possible from the political process. And they've done that in a couple ways. Firstly, we have to outline a set of objective criteria and a scoring rubric with certain priority criteria in our initial volume 2. So everyone's going to know exactly what goes into the scoring of these grants. And secondly, after we are allotted the money, we have 365 days to run a sub-grant selection process and put the properties into what is called the final proposal that then needs to go to the NTIA for approval. So I think that I do not doubt that has happened in the past. These are this is a lot of money. I'm sure political decisions won out over merit in the past. Hopefully not in Kansas. But I do think that the process is a lot tighter because NTIA has recognized that has happened. And we can't allow that to happen, especially, well, I'll give you the biggest priority criteria in NTIA's perspective is minimum BEAD project outlay. So that includes things like cost per passing and applicant match and technology delivered. So I think it's going to be very difficult to get those kind of things past the NTIA's approval. They're pretty thorough in their vetting of thing that goes before them. Those of us who are in the process of trying to get certain requirements in our initial proposal past NTIA would attest that they're very thorough. So again, I don't want to be Pollyanna and say that those things don't happen. They haven't happened. But moving forward, I think it's going to be more challenging to get those through.
Vineet, let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So sometimes those political pressures actually come from Washington as opposed to the state. Maybe someone who's in the Senate or in the White House says, I just don't like this final list you've come up with. Let's fix this way. Not uncommon. what do you see as the safeguards against the political pressures coming from Washington as opposed to from someone in Louisiana?
You know, it's an interesting question. We have at least in Louisiana, we have a really good group of legislators who support broadband, understand the needs of broadband and how it's impacting their communities. A couple of months ago, I was in DC giving a broadband briefing to our 6 congressional U.S. House of Representatives and our 2 U.S. Senior senators, or 2 senators rather. And I think they appreciate the work we've done, the level of engagement that we've provided, and so on and so forth. We invite their staff to any meetings that we attend throughout the state that are in their district. Many of them do attend to understand what's happening specific to certain processes of these broadband dollars and how we're planning to execute them. And so we're trying to be as forward-leaning and proactive in our communication with them. And as Jade said, NTI has tried to divorce this process as much as they can. We're going to run and everything that we do has a public comment period. So volume 1 had a 30-day public comment period. Volume 2 had a 30-day public comment, right? And so, we try to create as much effort to proactive engagement in getting companies and people to participate in this process. And so, we're fairly certain that people have the confidence and trust in our ability to execute, and we've created enough guardrails in terms of the integrity of the program to ensure, most importantly, to help answer their question, which is, how do we ensure that we don't have some of these donut holes that exist in my community?
All right, Michelle?
One thing I wanted to ask, what are you, the 3 of you, doing in terms of making sure that ex post, so not only the idea of, yes, they said they were going to do this and the firms have done this, but ex post going, what have we gained from this? Having transparency about what were the costs per new household passed, what was the cost per, previously underserved, that kind of thing. Do you have current plans to make that information be collected systematically, to be put up for public viewing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nate.
No, go ahead, Nate, please.
You sure? All right. I'll say, I think that the level of transparency you're describing is really important, both on the competitive end, to Dr. Jamison's question, and on the back end for the taxpayers, right? If to answer the prior question, if the governor or the General Assembly or U.S. Senator or an NTIA official said, you really need to consider Joe's broadband company, like, come compete, Joe, right? Like, let's go through a transparent competition to figure out whether you're capable of delivering for the people of North Carolina. Afterwards, though, right, once these projects are complete, I think it's going to be really important to demonstrate to the taxpayers that we will continue to hold providers accountable, right? We've got a public dashboard on our NC1 map that's available from our ncbroadband.gov link that shows every location that we've funded, all 44,000 households and businesses. It also kind of cost to the grant program per location, which I think right now is around $2,800 just out of grant funding. Of course, there's additional private sector match there. We're working on upgrading that dashboard to show project progress by grant, right? To be able to show grantee X has submitted its first 3 quarterly reports and the project is 40% complete with an estimated completion date of X. Right, we're not there yet, but I think that's going to be really important. I think all of these offices, Jade's and Beneath's too, are going to shift at some point in the next 4 or 5 years from being strategic planning and grant management experts to being compliance experts, right? To being oversight bodies, if you will, for our grantees to make sure that these commitments, whether they're service quality, availability, locations, affordability, or whatever, are met for the duration of the grants, or for that matter, the duration of the federal government's oversight, whether it's U.S. Treasury or the Department of Agriculture or Department of Commerce, the major kind of funders of broadband infrastructure. Each has, unfortunately, different terms of duration that they continue to oversee and require reporting from the internet providers. So all of our teams are going to have to become compliance experts to the extent that we haven't yet over the next few years to make sure this program continues to add value for Americans.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Nate, because that is one of the failures of the past. Is there was never a transition from we're handing out money and making announcements to, and now we're doing the heavy lifting of telling people, okay, you've screwed up, and here's how we're going to enforce your commitments. So,
that's right. Our state has actually outsourced. We've identified a risk management partner that will continue to provide grant compliance and performance monitoring, program evaluation to make sure that we are focused on process improvement, that we're administering the funds successfully, to handle our state auditor requests, not to mention inspectors general from all the aforementioned federal agencies. I think that's going to be a heavy lift moving forward.
Very good. Jade, you had something to say on this as well?
I would just echo a lot of what Nate said, that commitment to transparency needs happening in every state. If you see it's not happening in your state, I would encourage you to reach out to your broadband office. I was reading an article just a couple of weeks ago on a major allocation of funding in a state, and the providers weren't listed. And so that kind of thing shouldn't be happening. In Kansas, we list every single application proposed area map for public comment. We list every public comment, and states there are states out there who've been doing this a lot longer than us and do an even better job. So we try to take best practices from them. Nate, I know also Virginia has been around for a long time. They've got great data for public transparency that we'd like to replicate now that we're going to have resources on the administrative side through BEAD. And so I really just wanted moment to encourage people to participate in the public comment process. When those initial proposals come out, you do have the ability to weigh in on them. If you think the sub-grant selection process is inadvertently advantaging one type of provider or other, weigh in on that. We don't have all the answers, and we want these plans to be really informed by those they are going to impact. And so I know everyone's busy, but would really appreciate if people could participate in those public comment opportunities and make these plans really yours.
All right, thank you for explaining that. So I have one more question. I think we have enough time for it. Then I want to give you all a chance for your kind of closing comments. And Nate, you've talked probably as much as anyone about your systems for holding people accountable. Let me tell you another horror story from a past broadband grant program. There was one awardee or one recipient that received a lot of money, and the governor had said this is a great project, this is amazing stuff. This people in Congress said this is a great, amazing. I went out and visited, and I won't tell you the state nor the company. And they were showing me, they were very proud. They were saying, well, here's where we're putting all our fiber optics. This is amazing stuff. And I looked at the map and I said, but doesn't Verizon already have fiber and customers there? They said, oh yeah. But said, you're funded to build over here where nobody's serving. They said, yeah, but we can't make money over there. So we're making it over here. And that was their approach. They just simply, tried to go where the money was. So they didn't really build exactly where they were supposed to. So Nate, if you ran into that, what would be your enforcement mechanism? That they were down the road about a year and then it's suddenly clear that they're not doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They're spending money, just not in the right place.
Well, first, let me just say, Dr. Jamison, I really appreciate your commitment to making sure that Jade and Beneath and I don't sleep well. So what we need is more nightmare stories. There's not enough anxiety in our work right now. So I really appreciate that. You know, we've actually seen some versions of this. North Carolina, pre-ARPA, pre-American Rescue Plan, pre-BEAD, we had a small rural grant program that started, I think, in awarding in 2019. It started with a $10 million pilot. Some of those projects from 2019, 20, 21 are now hitting completion. And we've had a handful of projects of our grantees that have said, yeah, we committed, especially, let me just go backtrack for a second. Right now, to their credit, the FCC has improved mapping so dramatically, right? It's not perfect. We've got a lot of work to do to get it perfect, right? But we've got so much improvement from our visibility even 2 years ago, right? Our grant program was awarding against census blocks, right? And we've got grantees who say, well, you know, we gave you a shapefile that was supposed to approximate a census block, and we had a 500 home grant agreement, and we did these 500 homes. We're not sure it's exactly the 500 that we committed to originally, but you know, it's fine, right? Or there was a recent example of a grantee that said, you know, we did the 380 homes that you mentioned, but 11 businesses, I don't know where that came from. We don't have any businesses, right? And you know, like Vineeth's program, Jade's program, ours in North Carolina is reimbursement based. They got to show us the receipts as they do the work. That is a significant protection, right, for the state and for the taxpayers. But where those commitments, even if a project has been complete, if the project isn't delivering on the commitments of the original grant application, the original project scope, we are threatening and contemplating, in at least one case, actually clawing back those awarded funds, right? I mean, we've got to get this right. We're never going to get another funding opportunity like this, right? We got to make sure this one sticks. And to the point of the last discussion, right? I think staying on it over the next, not just year 1, year 2, but year 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, I think is going to be critical to making sure that every North Carolinian, every American actually has and can use a high-speed internet connection, because that's the main point here, right? That if anyone in Louisiana or Kansas or North Carolina doesn't have a high-speed internet connection in 8 years, whatever Vineeth or Jade or I are doing, we're in trouble, right? Wherever we are, you know, we will have missed an opportunity. And so I think holding a really firm line with our grantees and making sure those commitments are hit, it has to be priority 1 for us.
Okay, well, thank you, Nate. I'll take that as kind of also your closing comment. So then I'm going to go to Jade, your closing comment, then Vineeth, and Michelle, you get the final word. So Jade?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate my thanks for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. I think it's really important as broadband leaders that we are subject to some of these challenging ideas that are really causing us to take a closer look at processes. I think that's very helpful and very useful. Keep those coming to us as you hear them. Do feel free to reach out and engage with us. I think this is going to be life-changing for America, definitely for Kansas as an ag state. I anticipate when this is done, we're going to have, you know, our farmers are going to have better yields. We're going to have better technology to compete. We're going to be able to allow our rural Kansans to age in place through telehealth. We're hoping to see some workforce development and innovation and entrepreneur opportunities in rural Kansas. So this is a really exciting legacy type of work to getting it right, and appreciate all of your tough questions. So thank you very much.
Well, the tough question would be from my father, who is a farmer in Kansas. He would want to know how broadband's going to get it to rain at the right time in Kansas. All right.
Not
Vineeth.
a panacea.
Vineeth, final words.
Yeah, and look, when Nate said compliance, that is nightmarish, but it's important work. I don't know if I'm going to be here by that time, but We also similarly have people that's helping us with risk compliance and making sure the work is actually getting done. But look, this is a labor of love. We enjoy the work. There are bad days and good days, but at the end of the day, the litmus test from our perspective is in the morning when we get up, what are we doing to solving someone's problem? And at night, what are we doing if we haven't solved it to deprioritize those activities to make sure we focus on the activities that make sense for people. And so that continues to drive us, and every little day we make progress. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the fluidity of our efforts in office creates challenges because we learn real-time guidance or policy recommendations that we have to react very quickly on. And sometimes the pace and speed at which state broadband offices are moving, ironically enough, is sometimes faster than the private sector. If you think about it, there's probably 250 broadband office people between the states and the territories that's going to manage in excess of $42.5 billion. That's sort of like a hedge fund, right? A large private equity fund. And so I think where the private sector is coming in is, whoa, you guys are moving much faster than we thought. Can you maybe, how do we catch up? And so, we'll continue to adjust those dials as necessary. But at the end of the day, all of us, myself, Nate, Jade, and others, we're operating with that sense of urgency to getting everyone what they need efficiently and so that it's affordable, and we'll continue to make those progress. So really appreciate you having this conversation.
All right, Michelle, you get the last word.
Thanks. So I think everything I'm hearing from you guys is great, and it makes me feel good. I want to leave you with one idea though. And I'm thinking back to the 80s song that says like one step beyond. So one step beyond, like checking compliance, which, I'm going to look at the website you, Nate, you mentioned, it's great if it's saying cost per household or per locations that they cover. But what would be a very informative other piece of information to have is cost per new household covered, right? To get a sense, because if we're spending $100,000 and well, yes, that area covers 100,000 people, that's one, but if 99,000 of them were already covered, then what we've spent is really should be thought of, we spent this to get that extra 1,000. So if there in terms of the independent analysis of compliance, at the same time, people could look at and what's kind of the bang for your buck.
If I know I've already had my last word, but because Professor Connolly is a North Carolinian, I feel like I have to respond to this. I should just point out that our grant program, again, is focused entirely on unserved locations. So that cost is per new household. Now that'll shift, right? We are going to move to underserved. We have too many rural parts of North Carolina, particularly small towns across North Carolina, that have really old copper lines, right? That aren't being kept up, that haven't been upgraded for years. They're going to benefit from these programs too. But our work to this point and for the foreseeable future will continue to be unserved locations that don't have even that 25.3 level of service. So I appreciate your point here. I think we're on that. And I think Vineeth and Jade have similar commitments in their states, at least for the first phase of programs. And I would just encourage you as a North Carolinian, albeit a Dookie, I should say, to stay engaged with us and keep steering us in the right direction.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So Jade, Vineeth, Nate, and Michelle, we really appreciate your sharing your expertise. It's been excellent. I should add, you all know that Michelle and I and some other scholars were working on having grade cards that we'll have for each of the states, not to play gotcha, but to say, here's how things compare across the states. And here's how it compares to what we've learned through our research and such, just to help people kind of understand, Kansas is doing really well in this area. I need to talk with Jade. And we'll emphasize the very areas you've emphasized. that cost effectiveness, that accountability, and that transparency. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So I'd like to thank our audience for being with us today and for the staff of AEI for making all this possible. Please watch for further events on AEI. We have one on Monday on affordability of broadband. Share your thoughts with us and let us know what else we should be working on at AEI. Thank you for your time.